Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits and I'm still thinking what a shame it is that Alfred Hitchcock never directed any musical theatre or films. We might have got the man of La Mancha who knew too much. Well, thank you for returning to Musical Talk for this week. We are going to hear the second part of that conversation that I recently had with Josh Clark about the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. If you remember, last week he and I were talking about the fact that he had actually gone in person to Edinburgh this summer, 2021, and had seen some shows in the field, if you like. He's the only person I know who actually went this summer, and that's barely a surprise because it was a much reduced Edinburgh Festival Fringe for COVID reasons. It's all too clear and all too sad. But it was, as I say, a wonderful thing that there was a Fringe at all, and this year it came in two different flavours. There was the Fringe in the field, which, as I say, did see some shows, most of which were one-person shows for obvious logistical reasons, but there were a few musicals in there. As Josh said last week, he saw a show called Elvis, He's Back. So there were a few offerings to be found, but if you were really interested in musical theatre, and you know, I think you probably are, then you would have been better off going to the virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe. This year they had a dedicated Fringe player, an online video streaming service, if you will. You bought tickets for it for the shows that you wanted to see, and that's where most of the musical theatre offerings were. Today, Josh and I are going to talk about 4 of those in some depth, including a very magnificent and interestingly realised version of the 7 Deadly Sins, which, if you put that together with Elvis Presley, as we were talking about earlier, leaves you with Heart Brecht Hotel. That's a very clever joke. Write that down and look at it later. But moving on from that particularly painful joke, let's go into that interview. And as you'll hear, it picks up with Josh and I identifying what the 4 shows that we're going to be talking about in depth are going to be. And then we get into them. And I hope that you can too. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Musical Talk, which was vicariously at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Musical Talk. Today we're going to talk to a greater or lesser degree about 4 virtual shows that we saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. They are Coroner Cutie, 7 Deadly Sins, which people will recognise as a Kurt Weill piece, and Brecht, Suffragettes, Deeds Not Words, which was a community piece from Australia about the British suffrage movement, or female suffrage movement I should say, and finally Carnegie, the Spangled Scotchman, which is a difficult sentence, but an enjoyable show. So let's start then, if we may, with Coroner Cutie, because of the 4, it is the lightest by some margin. Yep. And that's not a criticism. It was a jolly piece. And before we even get into the plot, I'd just briefly like to talk about the format. Yes. Because we were talking about the different kinds of formats for the shows, and this was what you would call smartphone videos cobbled together. So no one met. There was no moment you could tell where any of the performers were ever in the same room together. So obviously filmed in the middle of lockdown in America. And you just have to admire the ingenuity, I think, of people who say, right, we can do this even in these terribly straitened circumstances. Yeah. And I've seen several other virtual shows, including The Crooked Spire was a British version, which did the same thing. And they knitted together various individually filmed people. And the problem is, in that one, they never got the eye lines quite right. So in this, they had managed somehow to make it look like when one character was looking across the room and you cut to the other room, the other person was looking at the same way back, so it never jarred. I wonder what you thought of the format of that first, because it's a kind of musical we've never seen before, and I suspect we will stop seeing.
I thought it was excellent. The initial aesthetic of it, as you say, is homemade.
Yeah.
But this has that veneer, but it's clearly so well planned. You know, they've taken a properly professional approach.
Oh, indeed.
To the circumstances in which we all found ourselves. This, I think, had a real sense of joy about it, because it was people doing what they really loved doing, despite...
Against all odds.
Against all odds, really that. But it wasn't just, let's turn on a camera, let's write a song, let's sing it and stitch something together. You could tell that this had had hours put into it, storyboarding, as you suggest, that where to look in every particular moment where you've got a split screen element or whatever it is. Weirdly, nothing felt cheap or sacrificial about the production values, despite the fact it was filmed by the performers in their own homes. So the editing was very good, and as you watch this, nothing felt jarring, or you didn't regret paying your money to watch something that someone had made at home. Actually,
good point. Actually, yes, that's a nice way of putting it. I'd go further than that. I would say that actually they made a virtue of the fact,
completely,
because they also had special effects. So the central conceit is that Coroner Cutie is an online dating service for the COVID period. It was very much of now, or certainly then anyway, contemporary. And when we cut to the website, there were three characters, if you like, a chorus, a chap and two lasses, all dressed in similar costumes, sort of white and pink and red ties and things like that, who were the avatars around the website. But there were special effects. There were hearts that came up. There was wording. You were briefly shown what it might look like on a computer screen. There was another effect later on where the mother is singing. We get the very strange sense. It allowed the central female characters, Claire, her mother is a character in the piece. She sings a song. She's often giving advice to her daughter, and it's recognised it's in lockdown because she is having it's overtly a lockdown conversation. They haven't seen each other, but they're staying in touch by video streaming options. But the mother has a Flight of Fancy song, basically, where we suddenly cut to watching her on a television screen. So they were using special effects. And once again, you can't do that so easily live. And actually, most video productions weren't doing anything like that either. The very fact that they were able to get things... most video shows where they'd stitch things together, the very fact they managed to do that at all was impressive. I will just mention the Crooked Spire again. They had spent their money, if you like, or the thing that they did that was unusual, which wasn't just filming, was they created a CGI bell chamber where this... they were building a windlass to help build the spire on the church. And obviously you couldn't actually, unless you've got access to one, how are you going to do that? So they had a CGI room. This was a bit more ambitious than that. But it was essentially, however, a Lonely Hearts musical, wasn't it?
It is, and what I think impressed me about it as well was because, as you rightly say, it is so decidedly fixed in a very specific context, one which is very unlikely we're going to find ourselves in, hopefully.
Fingers crossed.
Again, it's not the sort of show that is going to, have a life beyond this. And therefore, all credit to them for not thinking, well, this is going to be a one-off, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I thought what maybe stood this above some other similar shows which I saw of this style was the writing of it. Felt polished. It felt like it had been through maybe a few revisions. The diction of the performance, due to the clarity of the book, was so precise and very punchy and clear. You felt completely secure in the story that was being told, how it was being told. If you listen to the lyrics, they're all very clever and the rhymes are fantastic, and it's very modern. Even in the performance style, direct to the camera, it's got a bit of a Fleabag feel about it, I think, and confessional, very on vogue at the moment, I think, but also very, very polished performances as well.
Well, I agree with you, by the way, being absolutely the zeitgeist. I mean, there is a song, actually, where she's decided to join the Coroner Cutie dating website, Claire, and of course she has to put in information for their algorithms to pair you up. And of course it's about data protection and data sharing and what should we and should not give away. And then, yes, there's a song, and the lyrics say something like, give us your information, share all of your dirt. We may also sell the data for much more than it's worth. And then after all this, she said, but Claire's dissatisfied because because actually she's wondering how you can possibly find the perfect mate through the superficial questions. It's actually a lyric. Superficial questions, algorithmic processes. Are you into cats or dogs? Do you drink coffee or like tea? And I've written here that this song was both catchy but also sinister. There was a sense of who's on the other side of Coroner Cutie? Who's gathering your information? For what purpose? And the three avatars really helped create that. They were sort of friendly in a kind of come in, join us kind of a way, but also at the same time humanness. No, I'm trying to say the opposite of the word human. Inhuman. Yeah. But they were oddly, although they looked like humans, they were inhuman. You know, they were clearly created computer characters without any kind of soul. There was that. I did like that. I liked a lot about it, but I thought I was very taken by that sense of, that plugs into a lot of people's concerns.
Yeah, it does. And then there's the contrast between the mother character as well, and I think there's a strong sense through this of the value of real human connection and the value of talking. I think a lot of people rediscovered the telephone aspect of their mobile phone during lockdown.
Speaking, quite, yes.
Yeah, and so that came through, which I thought was a big bit of the warmth of the show, that very positive female role model of the mother as well, because they talk very,
I liked her, yes.
Yeah, they talk very openly about self-care and looking after yourself and not having to put pressure on yourself in those long days we had at home, social media, as you're saying, what everyone else was doing, you don't have to match. It's all right to be feeling lonely, because that was something which came through in the piece. Yeah,
absolutely. The mother gets a song, doesn't she, where she's also given a lot of the comedy lines, actually, funny enough. So the mother is counselling the daughter that if she's lonely she might want to go on to an online dating service. There's a world of romance you can find through your screen apart from watching softcore porn or something else obscene. There we are. I'm sure all options were used during the lockdown period. I haven't done the research. I should also say I really like one or two of the songs because they had an idea. Sometimes a song can miss having a point or just tell you what the plot needs you to do. But the actual opening, the first couple of songs, actually about life not being like a rom-com. Yeah. So she is she's on her own, she's bored, she's isolated because of COVID. She is sort of slumming it, she's just wearing joggers, she's eating cereal out of a box by the look of it, and she's watching rom-coms, and indeed the rom-com element comes up later on when she's trying to connect with a fellow who doesn't seem absolutely unsuitable after a lot of searching later on. But she does sing a song about, which I think rather nicely pokes fun at rom-coms themselves. After 90 minutes of hijinks, everything falls into place. In the closing montage, she'll walk down the aisle dressed in white satin and lace. And I thought, well, you've got most rom-coms pegged there. And then later on she says, why can't my life be more like a rom-com? That's her second song. And then, pardon my language here, but social life is kind of shitty if you're new to an infested city. I like those little throwaways.
Yeah, and that's also about comparing yourself to other people's experience too, isn't it? And what I liked about this show was, going back to the use of the technology, so they had some moments of split screen where you just saw simultaneously how different people were dealing with the same situation, and therefore making it okay to respond to things in different ways. I thought that was a nice little thing which they put in. But I've got to say, everything that happened in this show felt right. Nothing jumped out as a glaring, why did they do that? Which, if I was writing a show during lockdown, you'd feel like there was something which might feel a bit underbaked, underwhelming. So I think they've done such a really good job of this.
So Coroner Cutie, thumbs up from us then on the whole, I think.
Very much so, yeah. Nothing for me to pull it down. That's not what I'm here to do.
We'll move on to a very different kind of a show, which is The Seven Deadly Sins. Now, this is an established piece written in 1933, originally described as a spoken ballet, and contextually, I think we have to recognise it was written by Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht, two names to conjure with there, and they just fled Nazi Germany at this stage, so they themselves were, away from home, I suppose is the best way of describing it, but The Seven Deadly Sins has endured over many years. This was a video production, a German video production, sung in the original German, so with subtitles, because my German's not up to it. I don't know how yours is.
They're good.
Do you speak German? Ein bisschen. Yes, right. What did you know about, because you and Brecht have a history, not a romantic history, but what did you know about the show before you saw it? And then what did you think of this production, which I found very striking?
Yeah, I think my knowledge of Brecht and Kurt Weill is probably better than my knowledge of this actual production. Actually, it's my first time seeing it.
Same here, by the way.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I probably had expectations of what the style was going to be, even more so for the fact that it was a German production. So I thought probably this would be properly
Brechtian.
Yeah.
It's got that extra distance.
That's right. Well, absolutely. The fact that it was performed in German with subtitles, that's immediately a distancing thing.
It is.
But I felt that worked very, very well with this. I know that was an element which is probably unintentional. I don't know. Was this designed for a German audience? Probably originally. Probably. But what having the subtitles forces you to do is, if you don't understand the language that it's performed in, is to be reading the English and be processing that, and then to be watching the movement and watching the figures. And I use figures rather than characters because you aren't quite engaging with them as you would a person if you're talking to them. You don't quite engage in the conversation, so to speak.
Also, in person in a theatre even. There would still be a closer connection than you could have through this version.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's a constant, because of the technology and because of the extra distance created, it's not a show where you can just sit back and let it wash over you.
No.
You really do have to put a bit of effort into this,
Engage.
Don't you? And concentrate and focus on it. But you get a lot out of it through doing that. And I would encourage people, if you're able to see this, I think maybe it's disappeared from the internet now, but
it may come up. The thing about video things is they do come up again. So
don't be put off by the fact that it is German and in subtitles. I think you get a lot out of it for the amount that you put in.
Also, it was a tip-top professional production.
Yes.
There was nothing amateur about this at all. This was, this could have been shown at the BFI. It's absolutely a professional production. It was brilliantly performed. I should say it was also physical theatre as well. I can see where the word ballet comes from. They weren't dancing classically, but the figures, and I think we'll have to explore that, the figures are sensually exploring their locale in each of the settings. I think probably for people who don't know this, we ought to say that it comes in essentially 9 sections, the 7 Deadly Sins. There's a prologue section. So it's only 40 or 45 minutes in this version. So each section only lasts for a few minutes. There's a prologue, and then we deal with each of the so-called 7 Deadly Sins: sloth, pride, anger, gluttony, lust, covetousness, envy, and then we have an epilogue, which is the bookend to the prologue, obviously. And it's actually quite a feat. It's quite an exercise. An exercise is an interesting word, I think, in terms of the narrative, to work out how you could come up with I'm going to use character rather than figure, but a character who goes through each of those 7 forms of sin in a coherent narrative that takes you from the beginning to the end in a way that does work. It's not naturalistic at all.
No.
It can't be. And yet, exactly as you said, absolutely understandable, engageable, a lot to talk about, certainly to analyse in it, but I was struck just through the watching of it, the engagement with it that I had, that this was a remarkable piece of writing, actually.
Yeah, and we should also say that this production is the message you get from it is a feminist message.
Oh, yeah.
It's directed by, I haven't got the name here, but directed by a woman director. The performers are women. There are male figures.
There are. One playing a mother.
One playing a mother. So I think in terms of how this is framed, if I may start there, 7 Deadly Sins. Where does that idea come from? There's one part of this show which has music which is redolent of being in a church. It is very religious, and
it's kind of hymn, isn't it?
It's a hymn, and it's a male voice choir in the background, which feels very oppressive, even though it sounds very nice and hymnal. And this is Brecht, isn't it? When you juxtapose that sound with what you're seeing of the women characters, you've got the idea that the notion of a sin is patriarchal, is a
immediate judgment.
Exactly that. And you've got some positive messages in what they're singing, but then the way that Kurt Weill's done his music, it's all done in a minor key, which makes you question, what do they really mean? What impact does this have on people if the message, the idea of a sin is that you're going to be judged and you're going to be punished for acting in a certain way. There was a line, which I got in the subtitles, of course, in one of them, half an ounce more flesh means trouble. And
that's gluttony.
It must have been gluttony. But half an ounce more flesh. And it's the women, feeling, that's not gluttony.
No.
Half an ounce. But what terrible consequences and the pressure they feel under through the male gaze. And the male gaze is a very strong thing here. We've got mirrors, we've got men on screens, and it feels very sort of surveillance state for the women, that they're watched at every turn.
And worse than watched. I think it's in anger. I think Anna, who's the central character, who's in two bodies, so we'll talk about that in a minute, I think she's told that she must not object to being hit by rich men.
Yes.
And first of all, that's appalling in its own right, and then it's the qualifier of being rich men, that there's a kind of threshold whereby it would be unacceptable. It immediately tells you that this isn't a principle. It's a control. It's all about control, or so I think, and hypocrisy. So there's the cant of dressing. You can dress control up in these religious virtues, or pretend they're religious virtues, but they're still about control and manipulation and huge hypocrisy. The easiest one to understand and see is during gluttony. At this stage, what I'm going to call the active Anna character or figure is basically on display on the stage in a cabaret, and her face is her fortune, to use an old-fashioned phrase, or her figure, hence the fact she mustn't put on this extra ounce. And the family are instructing her through the avatar of the passive Anna, the other figure, her sort of split personality, if you like, for the purposes of visual representation, that she can't put on any weight whilst they are having a big old feast in the background.
Yes.
They've also been banging on all the way through how poor they are. She's the driver of this story in the prologue is that Anna, who's the daughter of this family, this male family, if you like, even though they're female characters, but patrician family, have sent her off to they've sent her off to a town in America where this is all set, in order to make a fortune over 7 years, so that she can bring it all back and build the family a house in which they can all be happy forever. But they don't appear to lift a finger at any stage. No. They do it all through control. So the very first chapter, if you like, is sloth. It's your choice. As Michael Flanders says, you can say both or both.
Well, yeah,
it's shown really obviously. Anna has been sent off to do the work while the family sit at home saying, we're so poor, now go off and do this for us and don't you dare slack, whilst we sit in our sofas, and then we can, and if you are slacking, we are going to sort of pray for you, which is, but in a kind of controlling, hands-on kind of a way. It's very, there's so much going on. I mean, what did you make of the split Anna character?
I think it worked very well to sort of see the impact on Anna of all the competing pressures she was facing, because seeing two representations of her sort of made you understand her mental state, really, that there was maybe the real Anna, and then there was the expected Anna, or how she had to be, how she was forced to be, I think.
Yes, I took one of the Annas as being the Anna who, the active Anna is the one I'm going to describe her. She was the one who was doing all the things that she was then being judged for as sinful. Yeah. Even though those things were they were both being judged as negative, and she was encouraged to endure them because that was the way the money was coming. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the money is the only thing that actually matters to the house, to the family for this house. Actually, her well-being is not considered at all. So it's basically she's being instructed to beat other people's playthings and play to their desires. And then there was passive Anna, and I call her that because she seemed to be the voice of the family in Anna. Mm-hmm.
It's very oppressive.
Terribly.
Because of course it's all focalised through her, but when she sings it's a single female voice, and when the family do, it's always a chorus. Yes. And it's a male chorus, isn't it? Even though it's meant to be made up of all sorts of people. So that really stands out, and with the Brechtian style, it's all symbolic, so you read into that it's, the mass against one. So it's overwhelming. I was just going to go to...
Please do.
When she shows glimpses of trying to fight against this, and it's a very symbolic moment where she just raises a hammer to the mirror that she's looking in, and it's quite a depressing message in a way, that the way to fight against it is, I guess, to take the radical feminist approach of
breaking
literally having to fight, because that's the only thing that's going to cut through.
It is, and yet the ultimate denouement of the story is, the epilogue is that after 7 years she has done what's required of her.
Yeah.
And she has done so by that odd kind of subterfuge of being told that it's a sin to do the things which are judged to be sins, but you must do those sins whilst we judge you badly for doing them, because ultimately the ultimate aim is the money. And then you've got this very disturbing thing at the end where it looks like active Anna has been subjugated, because when you in the prologue, as they sort of heading to the American town they start off in, because they go to a different town for each of the sins, I notice, passive Anna is talking enthusiastically about it, but there's looks on active Anna's face which says, she says I agree, but her face says differently. At the end, she has been destroyed as an individual, in the sense that she's been forced to go through all these terrible, terrible things at other people's demands, and given up love, and there's lots of little incidental things that she's had to do. She's been beaten, she's had to give up the one person she does love, she gets criticised, she can't eat, la la la. And then suddenly she, at the end, passive Anna says it's all been worth it. Active Anna agrees, but bearing in mind at the beginning she agreed and clearly didn't agree. That's where, that's sort of where we finish off. It's very bleak. Anna doesn't speak much triumph, or rather she does, but she doesn't triumph on Anna's terms, she triumphs on the family's terms, which is a tragedy. It's terrible.
Well, it is, and really that's why this works as a Brechtian piece, isn't it? Because it is, if not quite didactic, it's maybe not teaching us something, but Brecht didn't want to do that. He wanted to make us think, and
he's always worked.
well, exactly, and it's work on the part of the audience, isn't it? But I think we leave it probably feeling rather hopeless, but then as a male audience member, then you reflect on what you can do to ally is the word at the moment, isn't
it is, yes.
But you look back at just these pressures which are so deeply built into society, just like the role of the family can be something which puts pressure on women. And this is in a very specific time period, it feels, doesn't it? It feels like.
And he has just escaped from Nazi Germany, which is also an added flavour.
Yeah.
But it doesn't diminish the fact that the problems here still exist, maybe in transmogrified ways.
Yes.
Society isn't the same as it was 90 years ago, but it isn't by any means perfect.
No, that's right. So, I was grasping around there thinking, well, what is the message? How do you feel at the end? And I think probably it is something which forces you just to go away and think, is society like this? And do I contribute to this?
I left much more bluntly with a sense of desolation and anger, i.e. one of the sins, ironically, in the sense that, it was appalling to me that an individual, I didn't see it so much on gender, I saw it as an individual being crushed by a mass, which is once again a great bit of anti-fascism. I saw it very strongly as, she's been forced to conform, and by conforming, it hasn't saved her, it's destroyed her. That's all where I got on this. So, however, we should lighten this slightly, or at least mention Weill. Because I thought it was quite interesting, just as the production values in this piece, and we'll talk about Weill's music and how that works for or against the sins. So in terms of just the lighting, so for example, I noticed that there were several colour schemes. So under Envy, the room that we see the Anna figures in is green, as you would expect. In Lust, it's red. In Covetousness, it's purple. There's some very bold colours which seem to underline the emotional position. And, green is often associated with envy. And yet, and I've written this every time, Weill's music undercuts what the nature of the sin as we understand it is. So, for example, under Sloth, the very first one, it says here, the music is fast and not slothful. Yes. And then lots of things like this. There's lots of times when the music is actually oddly jaunty.
Yeah, but look, this
in this dystopia.
Yeah, and this is Brecht, because if you want to emphasise sloth, then you do that by
Vigour.
presenting the opposite, exactly, because it makes you think, oh, have I understood this properly? What am I actually looking at? We've got this jolly background, which therefore sharpens up the point, the
being
sloth,
made.
if you like. Yeah, exactly. Which is why that works so well together. And the lighting and the extra production values which have been added by this production team just add another layer to that.
Yeah,
I suppose, don't they? And they draw it out and make it even more apparent, which, seeing as it's being done in German, is very helpful for us as well.
Yes. Well, I'm certainly grateful.
This makes the point even clearer, doesn't it?
So overall then, I think we're saying that this was, as I say, I go back to my original point, that actually seeing it properly for the first time, I was struck by what a remarkable narrative it is. And then on top of that, you have all the extra layers and complexities which are added by Weill's music, then the performance, and then the physicality of the performance, and then the production values of the lighting, etc. like that. This, I thought, was a short piece that was so much bigger than its time slot, and has made me think next time a version of the Seven Deadly Sins comes onto a stage, I'd really like to see it. I think I'd really like to see it with you, actually, Josh, to see if it feels different, because don't forget, film can allow you claustrophobia as well. Yes.
I would like to see this particular production on stage, because I found it very oddly captivating and very difficult to look away from. The subtitles are a large part of that.
Well,
because,
of course, you can't miss it.
No, you can't, and you can't just sit back and listen to it. You're forced to watch. But we've briefly touched on it, but there's a lot of multimedia in this as well, which does create that oppressive atmosphere. And I think in quite a small black box theatre, this would work very well.
But it wouldn't work in the Palladium so well, or you'd have to.
No, I don't think it would, probably. No. So we'll have to look out for an opportunity to find it somewhere.
You may be hearing about the 7 further deadly sins from us in the future. The 14th deadly sin. Repetition, deviation and hesitation. Oh, that's a different programme entirely. So the next show is actually, if you like, part of a pairing. They aren't in any way actually paired, but they were both bits of community theatre. That's a show called Suffragettes, Deeds Not Words, and after that we'll be talking about Carnegie the Spangled Scotchman. And the reason I've paired them together for our conversation, although we will be dealing with Suffragette first, is that, as I say, they're community pieces, and community pieces are a particular form of musical theatre, it always seems to me. They're very heavily ensemble-based. They've often been generated by the ensemble as well. There's very rarely an auteur or an author. I mean, there can be. They often, therefore, can be a little bit free of focus, because if you're telling a historical story, in this case, female suffrage in Britain in the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century is a historical movement, it's a historical story. It doesn't have a clear beginning, it doesn't have a clear end. It's stages. You can try and make individuals villains and individuals heroes, but actually it's about not really that, I think. And I think Suffragettes and Carnegie take slightly different approaches to the same kind of concepts and come out with very different answers. So we'll do Suffragettes first. Now, the first thing to note here, or the thing that surprised me, was the fact that it was an Australian production. Now, I don't know enough about Australian history to know what the Australian female suffrage story is. So I thought this was an interesting choice to be telling the British female suffrage story, the Pankhursts of this world. It then had to work out, and I've alluded to this already, I think, it had to work out how it was going to tell the story. So I suppose my first question for you, it's not really a question, I suppose, really, it's actually an opinion, or your view on my opinion, which is that there are two ways of doing historical movement stories. And I might use the Titanic film that came out 20 years ago as a good example of this. I mean, it's not a historic movement, but it's a historic story that we know the ending of. So there's no surprise in the outcome of this. It's not been rewritten so that women don't have the vote. That would be a surprise and a travesty. But in Titanic, the film, they had to create some characters for people in the audience to connect with. And then feel their emotions about, as though the human tragedy of the thousands of people who were going to die in the Titanic going down wasn't enough. And perhaps it isn't. It's a block. It's almost too much to take in. In Suffragettes, we had a few named characters. Mrs. Pankhurst is there. We also get to see Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, who's most vocally opposed to female suffrage in Britain. But actually, most of the other characters were... I'm not going to say every man, because that doesn't work under the circumstances. Every woman characters. There was there were some women in a typing pool. who, by the way, incidentally, in those days were known as typewriters. The women were known as typewriters because they were using the typing machines. It's only over the years that the machine has become known as a typewriter. He said using old technology. And then there's a woman who gets sent to, Mrs. Campion, I think, goes to prison for 3 months. But these aren't, if they are people from real life, they're not famous people from real life. So, they are, for all intents and purposes, figures thrown in to illustrate plot points. So if you choose, and this chose on the whole not to create false couples, relationships, characters too much, to pin too much onto, to add human interest and emotion, that does leave you, therefore, with the rather bald story. I use bald in the sense of blunt.
Yeah.
Where do you hang your songs, and what are your songs going to be about? And I think it's suffered as a result of that, because my observation is that the first solo number comes 53 minutes into the piece, and then after that there's and even that's rather a series of lead singers singing separately in an ensemble piece, and then after that is the first song where an individual character on her own sings, and that's a song called One Day We'll Soon Be Flying. That's Mrs. Campion's character. That's an hour and 8 minutes into the piece.
Right.
All the songs up to that point are essentially forms of anthem. So just going through the titles of them: Here I Come, Rise Up Women, Stand Up Women and Be Strong, March, March, Take Cover, We're Coming. Just from the titles you can see there's a certain similarity. Now, I'm not criticising the piece for this, because I think that's all you can do with the approach taken to the structure. And the anthems did what anthems do. They are kind of everything from a national anthem to an anthem in a piece of musical theatre. It's sort of supposed to inspire you, and this is what these songs did. Whether a musical where your first 5 or 6 songs are all anthems is enjoyable, I have to use the word enjoyable, is another matter. But I think ultimately what I'm saying is, I think a decision made on the structural weaknesses of the kind of musical it is led to a certain sameness in the score. But I could be wrong. I've done a lot of talking there, Josh, sorry. I'd just be very interested in your view on this.
Yeah, no, you did say a lot of things there, but all worth saying and thinking about. And probably it is a symptom of the fact that it wasn't fully clear, I agree with you, what the intention was behind this. I agree with that, because it's clearly a piece with political subject matter. Now, is that enough to call it a piece of political theatre, though? I'm not sure.
Or is it a piece of historic theatre?
Well, exactly. Now, if it's, as you were getting into, if it's just historical theatre, then that can just be telling a story. And there's perfect merit in dramatising something that happened and showing us that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, if it's
Les Miserables.
Oh, exactly. If it's political theatre, you would expect it to have a kind of message, and for it to either lead you to think in a particular direction, or at the very least to go out questioning something. Now, we were talking about 7 Deadly Sins, and we were talking about the Brechtian elements, and there are a lot of Brechtian elements, very similar elements in this, which, for me at least, would guide me towards reading the piece as something political, and not just informing me, but challenging something. And this is where my confusion lay, because I was trying to work out, what should I be questioning? The story of suffrage, it's a very specific aspect of the feminist story, isn't it? It's the first wave, it's getting the vote, it's the political prisoners, and I don't know what the other side now is to that. I think we agree.
Yeah, you have
pretty much in society that it was worth doing, that it's a good thing.
It'd be very difficult to argue against female suffrage, I think.
Right. Now, to go back to those early anthemic songs that you mentioned, you just said that the anthems did what anthems do. Well, I'm not sure they did.
Oh, right.
Actually, I think they should have, and I was ready for a big rousing chorus number at the beginning.
You had your flag and everything?
Right, indeed. It was Rise Up, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Very close to that, Rise Up at the start. Well, the attack of that song was a lot softer than I was expecting, because it was nigh on a full company.
As they nearly all were. Company pieces, ensembles, absolutely, yes.
That's right. And so I I wrote down as I was watching it that this feels like something like Stand Up in Maiden Dagenham, which comes at the very end, and you finish on the big rousing, this is what we fought for, let's keep on pushing. And then, funnily enough, as I was writing that, the next song started, which was basically called Stand Up.
Yes.
But it was very similar again. You're right, it was the typewriters. It made me think of Forget About the Boy and Thoroughly Modern Millie, which is all of them coming together, against men, wasn't it? But it didn't have the impact.
Punch of it, yeah, quite.
It didn't have the punch.
Well, I think you made... Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. You make a really interesting point. If you start with an anthem, where do you go? That is a really interesting dynamic issue.
Yeah, and so to go back to the Brechtian elements, I was a little bit confused, because from a big anthem song like that, I expect to really listen to the words and be delivered something which I need to take in.
Yeah.
Now, behind some of those songs, we had footage of real suffragettes, didn't we? Historical footage. Lovely.
Projected on the background, yeah.
Exactly, good black and white stuff. So that adds then an extra layer, and you're reading the imagery as well as you're trying to read the lyrics, as well as you're reading the performance style. Sometimes you had choral movement pieces, let's call it, rather than dance, which went into slow motion. So then you're thinking, well, why is this happening? And for me, I just got a bit confused, and there were microphones, which was distancing, which was making parts of the play strange in the Brechtian lexicon. And my question was, could this have just all been done a bit more naturalistically? And would that have made it more effective? Because I didn't feel particularly drawn to the characters, which is surprising in a piece with this subject matter.
Yeah, that we feel sympathetic towards as a concept.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right. And I feel that this is sometimes where the Brechtian style goes a bit wrong, because Verfremdungseffekt and alienation and making things strange does not mean that you feel nothing towards a character. And in fact, you should. If it's truly Brechtian, you should be drawn into the characters. And the Verfremdungseffekt and the distancing techniques that are put in then just snap you out of it. And you only get that, strange sense of alienation if you have been in and then you're brought out. It shouldn't be that you never get in. And I felt with this that I never fully got in.
It was almost like a fishbowl in that sense. There was stuff going on. You said a lot of very interesting things there, and the thing that's made me think is the business about what its political aims were, if it had any. It could have done something simple at the end, perhaps, have just carried on telling the story, but towards the end just made everyone dress contemporary to say, are there any parallels with now? Yeah. But I think there was a much more interesting story hidden somewhere in here, because what arguments in the story and the narrative there were appeared to be about whether or not they should move from what might be called, and I'm using the shorthand here, democratic processes, because they kept getting bills to Parliament about female suffrage, which were then voted down, and they were quite understandably frustrated with that. If you're not getting it through the democratic process, do you move to physical disruption? And that was a question that was debated on several occasions, and in a strange sense, as far as I could work out what was going on, it seemed to be that there were various different speeds of movement going on in the organisation. Mrs. Pankhurst seemed a lot more cautious, whereas some of her acolytes seemed much more keen on it. But what we didn't really hear was the argument about, actually, well, why are we deserting democratic principles? Or this might boil down to much more, and this is an argument that is still going on about that historic issue. What won the day? Suffragists or suffragettes. And the suffragists are if you like, the lobbying, and the suffragettes are, if you like, the direct action. This is shorthand once again, obviously, so it's not precise details, but that's an argument which is still going on, and therefore has some interest. And I could see nascent elements of that in the plot, but I don't think it came across enough. I don't want to be too negative about it, because, as I say, you and I are very keen on what it was. The story is a good one. We all agree with the outcome. Yeah. But did this story quite get across that. I don't think it did.
No, so I think, if I put myself in charge of this production, I would appoint a dramaturg to this, because I think they've got all the elements there. I think the idea of having some original black and white footage is fantastic. I felt that was weakened by all the stuff that was on at the same time as it. So, you'd have someone
loss of focus almost.
Exactly. I don't think it added to what they were doing live. I think the live stuff competed with it. And if you maybe just cleared the stage and had the film bits on, then you focus on that, and then you bring the characters back, and you understand things a bit better. But hey, that's just me.
I think this all stems down from the fact that a choice was made on the way of telling the story, and therefore all the things we've identified have sort of come out of that. So it's not a criticism of the piece per se.
No.
It's there are some problems inherent with a structural issue, and everyone solves those in different ways. There is one thing I simply do want to talk about, though, and for me this was the Brechtian moment, not precisely in the way you've defined it. I mean in the sense of something really drew me out of the thing, so I had to think, that's such an odd decision. I'm now going to have to think about that. And it's when Mrs. Campion, who's in prison for violent acts, they're trying to force feed her. It's a terribly harrowing scene, actually, very well done, and reflects what happened. But as a sign of solidarity, she starts singing The Red Flag. Now, as far as I could understand it, this was pre-1917, and yet on the projection at the back, they had a CGI communist flag. It was a red flag with the hammer and sickle. Now, I didn't know that was... Well, I don't believe it was popular currency until the Russian Revolution of 1917. So this feels a very deliberate act. The red flag represents so much as a song. In British political circles, it has historically been the anthem of the Labour movement. And I use the word Labour movement rather than party because it's more associated, I think, with the 20th century Labour movement than perhaps the 21st century Labour movement. But once again, I'm just using a shorthand. But it has, for other people, it's seen not just socialist but communist. And the very fact they've chosen to put the hammer and sickle on the red flag behind it is communism, not socialism. And communism, certainly from a Western point of view, and certainly from a 21st Western point of view, is at best a failed experiment, and at worst a totalitarian regime and to be despised. So making a character, Mrs. Campion, who is the victim, giving her a song of solidarity, which is already possibly interpreted in two different ways, but then underlining that it's the communist one, not the socialist one, and communism is bad, he said, using a shorthand. What were they using that for? Because for me, that was basically saying, Mrs. Campion is now going to do something that you will lose sympathy for, probably, unless you are a communist. I never quite recovered from that. I still don't quite know what they were aiming at. It certainly took me out of the piece to allow me to think about it because, it did that clever thing of saying, right, okay, here's some contra views and opinions and things, but whether it told the narrative or helped the narrative, and by taking me out of the narrative, did it help me understand the narrative? No.
No, and I think it comes back to the idea that we were talking about at the beginning of this. Is there a real through line that we're meant to leave understanding? Your starting point, if you choose to go and watch a play about suffragettes, these not words, you're probably going in already rooting on the side of the suffragettes.
There were very few Asquith fans, I think, in the audience.
Well, exactly. No, I agree with you. I couldn't really offer too much by way of explanation of what
that choice.
What they might have been trying to get at. Does that flag mean something slightly different in Australia? I don't know.
Once again, that's a really interesting cultural question that I don't have an answer to. Yes.
Yeah, you'd imagine not, but I don't know. Or was it just meant to be, like you said, a sign of solidarity, which wasn't quite pitched right?
Yes. Did they just go for the wrong red flag?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Look, maybe it could happen, couldn't it?
Yeah, it could easily. Pull it off the internet.
Yeah.
Well, that's suffragettes, which we you will have gathered we found disappointing, but we were in favour of conceptually, and we pin it down essentially to a structural decision, which has then flowered into this slightly confusing narrative, I think.
It's ambitious. There's a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of very interesting theatrical elements in there.
Oh, yeah.
So I look forward to seeing the second version.
Indeed, yes. Suffragettes too, they're back and they're still angry. Which brings us on to the last offering today, and it's another community piece. Now, this is Carnegie, the Star-Spangled Scotchman. That is the last time I'm going to say that. I'm just going to call it Carnegie from now on. And of course, it originally went to the Fringe in 2016. It's a 2-hour, 2-act piece. We were seeing a recording made from in a theatre in 2019. So like Suffragette, we were watching a recording of a stage.
Carnegie Hall, I do believe.
It was Carnegie Hall, but not the American Carnegie Hall, the Carnegie Hall in Dunfermline,
yes.
which is actually where Andrew Carnegie was originally born. Now, we were talking about structure in Suffragettes. This had a gift. It's still telling a historic story, but in this case it was about a person, in this case Andrew Carnegie. So you've immediately got human interest because he was a real person, and therefore you're going to have an actor. The actor was actually, I believe, his great-great-grandson or something rather exciting. But actually he carried off the Carnegie character very well and made him, I thought, multifaceted, which is good because they didn't just paint him as one thing. In fact, that was the whole tenor and feeling of the piece. But because he's a human with a real story, there are some human interest elements you can immediately attach to that. But also, it did still have to wrestle, in my opinion, with the issue of it telling a historic story. And it had a framing device, which was somebody who had worked in one of his steel mines. No, it's not. You don't mine steel? That can't be true.
Steel plants.
Thank you. Someone who was working in one of his steel plants in 1892, who was killed, along with 8 others, as part of a trade union dispute, which was rather heavy-handedly put down by Carnegie's partner. And how much was Carnegie implicated? He was talking to the man we have to assume was St. Peter, who was working out who's going to come to heaven or go down to hell at the point where Carnegie is dying. I should say he's actually 83 in real life when he died, but obviously the actor was rather younger than that, so it looked like he was being prematurely ripped, but he wasn't. The structural issue there is that we are the audience being invited to investigate Carnegie along with John, the dead steelworker, to decide whether or not he should or shouldn't go to heaven or hell. That's fine. But that means you have to rely on the history. And that works really well in Act 1. These are only my opinions, by the way. I'm very interested to hear yours in a minute, Josh. But in Act 1, it finishes off with this trade union dispute of 1892 at the Homestead steel plant. And it gives you enough grey area for you to be thinking, oh, is Carnegie good? Is Carnegie bad? Is he a bit from column A? Is he a bit from column B? Is he exactly as we all are, a bit grey in a lot of areas? The problem for me was structurally Act 2 then didn't have anything to do because they'd used up all the scandal in real terms. And I thought Act 2 was a little bit full of filler because we then get to see Carnegie marrying and having a child, and that's lovely. But it didn't do anything to propel the story along except tell us that he had done it. The wife wasn't really important in his life later on, or certainly not portrayed that way. The daughter is not really given anything significant. She's a baby and she's named after Carnegie's mother, and that's her involvement. Then we get he buys a stately home in Scotland where he spends many years. He's got ambitions to promote world peace, but that doesn't work out. Thank you, World War I. And then he dies. So I think Act 2 is a little bit more point to point in the historic story and doesn't have much to say because there's no scandal really. Act 1 was where all the meat was. I really enjoyed the piece, don't get me wrong. I thought it was fantastic. I thought some of the songs were amazing. But if I had been writing it, I would have taken it up to the end of Act 1 and then had the judgment then. But there we are. I've given you my dramaturg take on it. What do you think of Carnegie? Because I know you liked it, as I did.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it's a very straightforward and simple production in its values.
Oh, indeed.
It's concert style largely, isn't it, really? So if you can imagine everybody on stage and they come up and sit down at various
when they're
points.
needed, quite.
Exactly. I felt that worked very nicely. It was just the story of the man, told very clearly, very engaging, quite simple, great score. Which stitches everything together. Great voices as well. I thought it performed fantastically. That framing device, very straightforward, as you say. They're on trial. Now, look, I probably would agree with what you said about Act 2, and they're not necessarily being the meat. But I've tried to read up about Andrew Carnegie the Man, and it seems like this Homestead steel plant dispute was the controversy of his life.
Yeah.
And it's the sort of the thing which, if there are any ardent critics of him in the world, would always go to say, but this
is why he's a rotter.
Right. But he is a philanthropist, isn't he? I mean, he started off building a library in Dunfermline, and then his legacy still lives on today.
3,000 more libraries, I think they said, ultimately, which is a lot across the world.
Right, and he's given his name nowadays to the Carnegie Book Awards, which is an annual thing for young people's literature.
Yeah.
So it's all good stuff. Now, I think this fits into the very modern thing of, mining back through people's lives. If you want to criticise them and tear them down, what's the thing they did? Everyone's going to have something. Yes. All right. This homestead plant dispute was a pretty bad thing.
It is egregious, but he's got a let-out clause as well, because he wasn't there. He was on holiday. He was actually in Scotland. The question is, how much was he controlling it, wasn't it?
That's right. And so you mentioned earlier that it was his family descendant who's playing the role. It felt a little bit like the family are well and truly sick and tired of having people point out this
the blemish.
This blemish. So, okay, fine, perfectly valid, but once they get past that in the show, there probably isn't that much more to say, because apart from that, there's a lot of good things which he did, really, isn't there?
Which would explain, by the way, every now and then when John was looking for negatives, particularly in Act 1, and St. Peter was turning to him, it always felt like, John had been asked to make the judgment on St. Peter's behalf. But every time he said what a rotter this man was, St. Peter would then say, but hang on a minute, there's this good interpretation of what's going on. And then John would have to say, yeah, you're right.
Yes, and so actually in that way, when you think about it, strange to have someone who was killed in this episode sort of having to say, oh, well, I died as a result of him, but yes, all right, he was okay.
That was awkward at the end, wasn't it? Because
that
no spoilers to say that Carnegie goes to heaven in this choice.
Yes. And in fact, it's the steel plant worker who actually does forgive him. That could have been done in a different way, maybe. Do we need those people to forgive him? I don't know.
Well, I agree with you there, because actually I thought the one thing and it was about the only one thing, the Act 2 point-to-point, I think, is a weakness of the story. And it's a historic story. There's only so much you can do with it exactly as you've identified. There's only one real blemish. There is another scandal, but once again, Carnegie is so distant from it, and it's not mentioned. It's not even picked up in this, so it's not important in that sense. I thought the framing device failed at the end, because actually I thought we, the audience, were being asked to make a judgment on Carnegie, and I think what I would have liked is that when it came to St. Peter making his decision after listening to John, either John didn't make a judgment or blackout just as the judgment's being made, because I thought that as an audience, that was the one time I felt shortchanged. I thought that I, as an audience member, had earned the right and had been invited along on the journey to make the judgment with John and St. Peter on Andrew Carnegie. And we weren't. We were presented with the fact, by the way, this is how the story ends, he gets forgiven and he's off to heaven.
Yes, that's
Even though there's quite a long suggestion that he might not actually have believed in heaven, but there we are.
Well, that's it. I agree. This is sort of reputation fixing, it feels like to me.
Did it feel like a hagiography in that sense? Because there was a danger. The only times I felt that actually this is so clearly pro Andrew Carnegie was every time St. Peter told John to wind his neck in, basically.
I think probably. Because actually what I enjoyed about this and why I would go back and watch it again, it isn't anything to do with the plot whatsoever. It is the score, and it is and it is the voices. I really, really enjoyed that, and I think in terms of all the shows we've spoken about, musically, this is the one that I admired the most and could just sit back and listen to, and it was if I might personally say, a moderately interesting glimpse into a man that I didn't really know much about. But the score saves it. If it was a worse score, you'd maybe think
we might be giving a different story. Well, I agree with everything you've said here. I took notes, as I know you did, and I've got lots of lovely circles on my sheet of paper that says very good song, good song, good song. A good song tells story well. I've written it all the way through, and it wasn't just a one-off.
Yeah, tells the story well. That's the thing. Easy to follow. you feel like you definitely know him by the end.
You do, yes, absolutely.
So
Ian Hammond Brown, I believe, is responsible for the score, and I would say well done to him. Do you want to pick some highlights from that score?
well, there was one that really stood out, I think, which was old sort of American Western style music, which gave the sense of all the steel plant workers, and it felt a bit, well, Western's the word, really. What was it? Telegraph, railroad, British steel, sort of
Bridges steel.
Bridges. Oh, was it? Okay, well, that makes more sense.
It does, yes.
But yeah, I did wonder. But that was chugging along in the background with all sorts going on in the foreground.
I've written that down as the Sarsaparilla song, and it's the first one I wrote really very good song against. It had a kind of the Hallelujah song, and exactly as you say, there was this the chorus was singing regularly. Telegraph, railroads, bridges, steel was constantly drummed in the background of each, and then as the chorus for each verse, there was a lot of hallelujahs. Look at the advantage. And it actually covered a lot of his years when he was starting off from, he started off as a telegraph employee. Telegraph being the big communication thing. It's all at the forefront. But then he invests with his mother's money into these things, and he invests well, and therefore he moves into railroads, and then he moves into bridges, and ultimately he moves into steel. They collapsed about 20 years very nicely into a 5-minute song, which was catchy, good diction, told the story, nicely constructed.
Yeah, the diction's perfect. It's my hearing.
Sorry. And wasn't afraid to talk about. It spoke about the Bessemer process for steel production. Now, we did the Bessemer process at school, but that was the last time anyone's mentioned it to me. It doesn't come up very often. So, I like the fact that it was solid and honest in that sense. There's a quick joke about him being a man of steel as well, which I quite like, which obviously is a phrase for a Superman. So that was a great song. Did you have any other songs you particularly like?
Was it one called The Gospel of Wealth?
Which was one of his books, wasn't it?
Right. That one just stuck in my mind, sort of the lyric of it.
Yeah, there was another story song was in Act 2, and actually there's a question about J.P. Morgan wants to buy out Carnegie, and if he does, he's going to do it at a very large amount of money, which means Carnegie can then spend the last third of his life being philanthropic. Not charitable, I noticed, but strategically philanthropic.
Yes, the strategic philanthropy, and that was then he started off with that first library in Dunfermline.
And he opened the park in Dunfermline, which is a nice little bookend, because at the very beginning, the family are kicked off the park by the squire, who won't let the riffraff in, essentially. So lots of good book ending in the narrative there. Yes, once again, that was a good story. The story song here is how it, the negotiations with Morgan all the way through, the list of charitable events and things that he had done, including building a Palace of Peace in The Hague in 1913. Unfortunately, a bad year to be doing it in, but other good songs I liked. There was a song about camaraderie amongst the steelworkers. So they're singing. This is before the strike in Homestead, but it introduces them introduces us to them as a phalanx of people who have a community. It actually developed a community. I didn't think it was one of those songs I didn't think I was going to like, because I thought I could see what this is doing. I mean, it immediately disarmed me by. They're fully aware of the dangers in their job. They're fully aware of the hard times they have. They're fully aware of the fact that they are probably being exploited and possibly even oppressed. And yet, at the same time, they have the camaraderie of each other. They enjoy it. They've got a job. They recognise that. It's reflected in micro what the whole piece is about in macro, which is actually no one is purely good or bad. No situation is purely good or bad.
And that you shouldn't perpetually stain people for the things that go wrong.
Indeed.
People can do bad things or make mistakes and can still deserve forgiveness. All men are flawed. Yeah. There
was even a Gilbertian style patter song, not quite the same thing, but because if anyone is set up as a fall guy, it's Henry Clay Frick, who is the man who actually put down the trade union fight in 1892 and was Carnegie's number 2 and partner. Although, once again, although he's painted as an absolute villain in the second act, Carnegie sort of kicks him out of the partnership, and we are told that Frick sues and wins. So actually, even he obviously does have a point when, Carnegie was doing him down there. But this song I really liked. I've written Clever Tongue Twister. I don't know how much you remember about the song, but It also reminded me of the banjo song, one of the songs in Assassins by Stephen Sondheim, funnily enough. It had a certain kind of American feel, jauntiness, which, the banjo presents, almost bluegrass, but not actually country per se. But it's just something about it that sort of resonates with America. And lots of lyrics, which was telling the Frick story, because it wasn't about Frick, the piece, only the song. You had to get a lot of Frick information in. Careful how you say that.
Yeah.
And of course they did that in a sort of a bundled lyric, but the bundled lyric was done in a kind of bibbidi way, which I recognise as a proto-patter song, So the score I thought was very impressive. There were some emotional songs, Carnegie's mother spends a lot of time singing even after she's dead.
Yep.
And they are, I'm proud of my son songs and isn't my son good songs, and you understand that. Mother love was actually more important, I think, than romantic love in this.
Yeah, definitely.
But we then move towards the end of the piece, and indeed I think the end of our discussion. And the funny thing about it was, bearing in mind he was a man of many dictums, and he wasn't just a philanthropist with money, he had a view about world peace, which came crashing to the ground with the First World War. There was one little line I shall take away from it, which apparently is one of his sayings. Certainly, if the piece is to be believed, he said, "There is little success where there is little laughter." And I thought, that resonates with me, and I thought, that's very interesting. Here is a piece about a man who died 102 years ago, and yet there is something in his philosophy that I can use. So I suppose my question to end this discussion on then is, if we, the audience, had been given the opportunity to make the judgment on Carnegie up or down, where would you have put him?
I think definitely up.
On the side of the angels, yes.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And like I said earlier, the only query I would have is whether I need the point of view of the people who had suffered as a result to convince me of that.
Yeah, I accept. Yeah.
So, yes, for that reason, maybe 4.5 stars.
Out of 5.
Out of 5, of course, yes.
I agree. Well, Josh, thank you very much for a proper gallop through 4 very different shows, although lots of threads I think we can pull between them. Certainly the word Brecht has been, fortunately it's not copyrighted, so we don't have to give anyone a sixpence every time we say it. But every conversation with you about Edinburgh has always been interesting, but I think this time in particular we've really got to some depths about some shows which we've all had to experience in a different way. So thank you so much for helping to bring those shows much more to life, possibly, than even I had found them.
Well, thank you as always for having me on. It's been lovely to be back talking about,
isn't it,
about shows, but in Edinburgh specifically, and perhaps next year, I'm sure next year we'll have a lot more choice of what we might be discussing then.
I'm also going to say, see you there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Musical talk. Well, there we are, 4 very different shows, choosing some very different ways to get themselves across in a virtual way. Now, if we came across as a little bit negative on one of those shows, it wasn't meant that way, as we said in that discussion. It was purely that once you make a particular decision on how you're going to portray the story that you've chosen to tell as part of your musical, it can take you up some paths. Sometimes that can be successful, sometimes it isn't. This really all comes down to dramaturgy. It isn't enough sometimes just to write a story, sometimes you need to hone it, develop it, and often have someone else come in and say, have you considered doing this, that, or the other? However, all 4 shows were worth watching, and I am truly grateful that they and other musical theatre offerings were available in some form at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And there are still a few, not many, but a few shows that we haven't yet discussed, and they will be coming up in future episodes. So, stay tuned for those. But by stay tuned, I don't mean listen to episodes of Musical Talk in perpetuity, whilst you're waiting for a fresh new one to turn up in a week's time. You can have time off to, sleep, talk to your family and friends, eat occasionally, and all those other bodily functions which are all too essential, but really not suitable for mentioning, so I'm not going to. And indeed, to make sure I don't accidentally stumble upon the words that would reflect upon those bodily functions, I'm going to stop talking completely. And to do so, I'm going to bring this to a full stop, but I'm not going to use the full stop, or the word period if you're American. I am going to use, however, the famous ending phrase. And here it is. Goodbye. Blimey, that took a long time, didn't it? This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos and presented by Thos and Josh Clark. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. He was talking to a man we have to assume was St. Paul on the gates of St. Peter.
That's the one, yeah.
Thank you. God, my Gospel's all up the spout.